From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. While millions of Canadians are self-isolating at home, hundreds of thousands of other Canadians across the world are trying to get home. As the pandemic was spreading in March, nearly overnight, borders closed, flights canceled. Students, travelers, people living abroad found themselves not just thousands of kilometers away from home, but layers of bureaucracy standing in their way. Foreign Affairs Minister François-Philippe Champagne calls repatriation on this level one of the most complex foreign affairs missions in Canadian history.
We've seen countries imposing airspace closure, airports closure, martial law in some country, travel restrictions. So my job and our job is really to make sure that we find safe passage for these people to be able to come back home, because home is the safest place now.
The federal government has repatriated around 20,000 people over the past 2 months, but still, more than 340,000 Canadians remain stranded abroad. Today, we're talking to two people who are wrestling with the many questions surrounding repatriation. First, Scaachi Koul, culture writer at BuzzFeed News. You may know her and her stories about her dad from Twitter. She lives in New York. Her parents are from Calgary. They find themselves in the difficult situation many Canadians are in. Her parents are in their late 60s and early 70s, both immunocompromised, and now they're stuck in India after what was supposed to be a short trip. Then we're talking to Toronto Star's immigration reporter Nicholas Keung. He knows the laws, the ins and outs of repatriation, and some ideas on how the government can get Canadians back on home soil. How are your parents? You talked to them yesterday.
So I talked to them late last night and then early this morning. And so last night things were okay. I think they're really frustrated. This morning they're feeling a bit better.
I know you've told me about this before. Obviously, you've told me about your parents, but it's been so convoluted. Can you take me through how they got from Calgary to India and where things stand now? How did this even happen?
They go to India every couple of years. Most of our family's still there. Largely they are in Jammu, in Delhi, and in Jaipur. And so they went on March 1st for a wedding, which is now they only seem to go for weddings and funerals, which I don't want to go to either, but that's neither here nor there. So after about 2 weeks of them being on this trip, me and my brother noticed that things were starting to get rough and that it might get hard for them to get home, especially because they were supposed to go through Europe to get home on a Lufthansa flight. And my father, whom I love very much, but I will kill him after this. I will murder him. And I would say 95% of why I'm trying to get them home is so that I can be the thing that kills him. Because when I told him to come home, he did not listen to me because he is an arrogant 70-year-old Kashmiri pundit.
There were 3 boys walking. I said, hey, keep the distance, they said.
Are you ready to come home?
I'm not keeping my hopes high. Although it seems the domestic travel may open, what will that get me?
It would get you to the airport.
Did they not take it seriously at first, or they didn't know the scope of it? Like, what was happening there?
I think 2 things were happening. One is that they weren't taking it seriously, which in all fairness, I don't think a lot of people were taking it seriously because we didn't know what the hell it was. And we thought it was just like a bad flu coming out of China. And then the other issue was that by the time they sort of were ready, okay, like we need to get out of here, the Indian government was already putting in lockdowns. There wasn't time to sort of fix anything. And then commercial flights were getting canceled like crazy. And then it became an issue of it might just be better for them to stay there and wait out the worst of it, which is what ended up happening inadvertently. Because I don't really want my immunocompromised 70-year-old father and my 66-year-old mother to be like running around on trains and getting on flights and having layovers in Munich and then another one in Toronto and then to Calgary. I don't really want them doing that. So we just ended up having to wait. I think emotionally they're having a really hard time. They're far away from most of our nuclear family. I mean, we have a bunch of aunts and uncles who live near them. My brother, his wife, and his kid live 15 minutes from them. And to not even be able to like wave to my niece through a window, I think has been particularly hard for my mom. So they're not having a good time.
You've really had to overnight figure out how this whole repatriation system works because you've been in touch with Global Affairs Canada, you have been on the phone constantly with airlines, and navigating that has seemed like a total maze too.
Yeah. So their commercial flight has been canceled 10 times so far. We're on the 11th rebooking, which is for June 2nd. So I'm hopeful that that actually leaves. We've been in touch with Global Affairs. We've talked to people at ROCA, which is the Registry of Canadians Abroad. We've talked to their MP. We've talked to the Secretary for Global Affairs. Honestly, if I never have to speak to one more person at the Canadian government for the rest of my life, I would be so happy. It's like, I'm so annoying. But then also I have a platform where I can go on Twitter and be like, what gives? And a lot of people don't have that. And so if you don't have that, what are you left with? I wrote a story about this for BuzzFeed a little while ago about people who had older family members stuck in India in particular, because it's been such a challenge. And people are like, we have no information. If a foreign government has put in place these regulations on what to do with domestic travel, I can't really get mad at the Canadian government for not knowing what to do. But it's been incredibly complicated. I can't imagine being 80 years old and like trying to maneuver this.
In the BuzzFeed piece that you wrote, you spoke to really dozens of families that are going through the same thing that you're going through, that have relatives in India that they're trying to get repatriated. And there was this saying that you wrote in it that it seems like you're finding comfort in it every day above ground. What does that mean?
My friend Isaac Fitzgerald, he is a former BuzzFeed colleague of mine and just a nice boy who lives in Brooklyn. And Isaac has a saying that's every day above ground. And it's his way of answering the like, how are you? But Isaac always answers that question with every day above ground, which is an acknowledgement of how lucky we are to just sort of be alive. And I have said it to myself repeatedly every day since this has started, because it's sort of the only thing I can cling to. At least I have the comfort in knowing that everybody I am close with is alive and healthy. And that has to count for something. And that has to mean that there's some hope somewhere.
And that's Scaachi Koul, culture writer at BuzzFeed News in New York. And a quick update since we spoke for this interview, Scaachi's parents have now been offered a repatriation flight by Global Affairs Canada. There are still many details to sort out, and there isn't a confirmed date for the flight yet, but things are starting to move, and they could be on their way home soon. Up next, Nicholas Keung, the Toronto Star's immigration reporter. As we just heard, there's frustration, many moving parts, and different laws from dozens of countries to sort through. Nicholas is going to take us through that and make sense of this complex mission coming up. Nicholas, thank you so much for making time for us.
My pleasure.
So I know this is a completely abnormal time, but how does repatriation of Canadians abroad under normal circumstances, how does that usually work?
Generally, repatriation means that, it was an attempt by the Canadian government to bring home Canadians from overseas. It usually involves working with foreign governments to coordinate with local officials, for Canadian officials to go in to help bring the Canadians home. And it also involves usually working with commercial transportation companies to coordinate the efforts. So before and after the pandemic, I would say the approach would be similar. But I think what makes this time with the pandemic, what makes it different is on so many fronts. One is the scope of this crisis is global. Unlike, for example, the most recent Canadian repatriation efforts that I can recall is the Operation Lion back in 2006, when Canada went into Lebanon, when war broke out between Israel and the Lebanese militant group. But back then we were talking about, trying to repatriate 15,000 Canadians out of Lebanon. So this time, we're talking about at least more than 500,000 Canadians stranded overseas. In terms of the situation, this time we're talking about, almost universally, every country actually at the time, already started closing the border in March, and all commercial airlines have already reduced their services significantly. So in terms of the scope, in terms of the circumstances globally is very different, because at least, when the war broke out in Lebanon, between Lebanon and Israel, Canadian officials could still sneak Canadians out of the country to neighboring countries that were not at wars. But this time, the whole world is under siege.
There's nowhere to go, yeah.
Yeah, the circumstances is so much more different, and the scale is so much more different. and in terms of the speed as well. But I just think there's so much underestimation of the public of how fast circumstances could change, how fast international border closings, policies, border measures actually could change overnight. I think that everyone underestimated that.
That things just in a matter of hours, that countries were revoking airspace, that landing rights were being taken away. It happened in some places, like you were saying, overnight, truly.
Absolutely. And I think Prime Minister Trudeau actually, I think, made the first call on a Friday, on March 13th, I believe, asking Canadians to return home.
Canadian travelers should return to Canada via commercial means while it is still possible to do so. Let me be clear. If you're abroad, it's time for you to come home.
And within that week, we had 1 million Canadians returning to Canada within 1 week by air or by land. And I think that just shows the scale of the whole crisis we are faced with this time. It's unprecedented. That's the only word I could use, unprecedented.
I mean, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister calls this repatriation Canada's largest ever in peacetime history. That's pretty clear. Can you explain how complex this mission really is? I mean, there's so many different players involved in this.
I think generally, as all the commercial airlines started reducing their service, they were dealing with different countries closing their borders at different times. So in the modern world, when people travel, they don't really, have necessarily travel by direct flights. And sometimes the distance, physical distance, could be a barrier to be able to do that. So when you have between one country and another country, it's almost like a huge puzzle for the Canadian officials to arrange flights, where they could commute, from one spot through another airspace, and another space. They have literally, they have to work with multiple countries. And then the other challenge is travelers. They don't just hang out in the capital city. They are spread across a country. So we are talking about even when there's a repatriation flight arriving to pick up Canadians, how do you arrange local transportation from a rural area in Peru into the major city? Domestic airports, domestic flights also all canceled. So the only way for someone to come from rural Peru to the capital city, to the only international airport of the country, is by road. And it's like a 9, 10, 14 hours bus ride if bus service is still available. And then there's also local roadblocks, frontline local police may not know they're allowing Canadians to travel to the capital city. So there are just so many roadblocks after roadblocks. And then there's also the logistical issue. The only way for, obviously there's so many Canadians on the ground. The only way for communication between the Canadian government and the Canadians on the ground would be through email, text. The demand definitely outnumbers the supply in terms of the seats on the plane. So it's almost like a lottery. Every time when there's a flight coming within 24 hours, usually people are notified within 24 hours the flight is landing at a certain time. If you want to get on board, make sure you respond ASAP. And then I've heard from stranded Canadians saying that, usually within minutes, all the seats were booked right away. And plus, the airlines also request social distancing on the flight. So even though a flight normally would have a capacity for 500 passengers, because of social distancing, we're talking about maybe they could only take 150 at a time.
Yeah, reduce load, yeah.
And then the cost also adds up. People are complaining about price gouging. But think about the flight would have to be empty when they land into a foreign country. So there's no money to be made on an empty flight flying in. And then there's a reduced capacity. I'm not on the side of the airliners as well, but it's just some of those realistical challenges and issues that I think we all have to think about.
That there's many, many different factors here. You're talking about different countries, different laws, airlines. It's a very, very complex situation in almost every country in the world. You're not just dealing with one country here. You're dealing with multiple ones.
Absolutely. I think that's all these factors making this effort so complicated and difficult to maneuver and navigate from the perspective of the passengers and also from, our foreign affairs officials too.
Do we know how many Canadians are still abroad and want to be repatriated, that they want to come back?
We started off, I think, with 500, and at least, in mid-March, we started off at around more than 550,000 Canadians. And as of the beginning of May, the latest data we have last Monday, but it's now reduced to 341,000 as of last Monday. And we know that the majority of them are still in the Americas, in Asia, and then in Europe. There's still a lot of people.
There's a great chance that that number is actually larger than that 341,000.
Yes, these are just the numbers of Canadians who have kept in touch with Global Affairs Canada, registering their names so the government Ottawa would have an idea of the distribution of the Canadians in different countries. Because I think most people, when they travel, they don't necessarily, upon their arrival, they would, register with local Canadian embassies. I don't think most people would do that. I know when I travel, I don't.
Yeah, I haven't either. Is there any legal obligation for the Canadian government to repatriate Canadians? Is there a legal requirement here?
I don't think generally, any government is obliged to repatriate their citizens from overseas, even in terms of a crisis situation or natural disaster. The reason why I say that, for example, I've worked on a story about people trying to get health coverage while stranded overseas. Usually circumstances like this, sort of like war, natural disasters is not really something, an event that would be covered by insurance plans. So I just assumed it would be the same. It's more like a moral obligation.
It's the sense of goodwill of your government should look after you if you feel you're in danger and to bring you back home. It's almost a moral argument.
Exactly. And I think that's also what the intent was when our PM, Prime Minister Trudeau, actually made that call, the few days prior to closing the Canadian border to advise Canadians, urging them, everyone to come home now. I think that's we got a sense at the time what was coming, that the border closing was coming, and they were advising partially is to mitigate the government's work later on for the repatriation efforts too.
Foreign Affairs says India remains the biggest challenge in repatriation efforts, that thousands of Canadians remain there. Do we have a sense of why it's been so difficult in India specifically?
I think one, we talked about earlier, the local roadblocks to get to the certain airports still open. And two is India is a vast country. And I think, even for people to go from one city to another by road is a huge distance. And then communications, and then the cost too, because I've got emails from people stranded in India saying that they need help for the money. And then I think, there's a check and balance, administrative bureaucracy, red tape in terms of approving those loan applications as well. And this could be the sheer volume of the work. For example, in most of the other countries, I was actually surprised, how many Canadians actually were in Latin America, for example. I think there are the pros and cons, trying to repatriate people from India, because probably they're dealing with one country instead of having to transmit through many Latin American countries. Like I'm just comparing the same efforts. I think Latin America, you have to deal with so many jurisdictions, but maybe in India, you just have to deal with the federal government. But then, there are a lot of logistical concerns, just the number of people, the volume, and then the internal barriers to travel. I think those would be the key issues faced by the Canadians in India.
I have a friend who is also on this episode who, like many Canadians, is facing this issue with her parents. Her parents are stuck in India. Their flights have been canceled 10 times. The flights are in the thousands, but she says she's willing to get her parents back home and willing to do whatever it takes, but simply just can't make it happen. There's no physical way to do it right now. Hers is really one story of many in Canada. For people in this scenario, what can they actually do? What is actually actionable to try to bring their family members home?
I don't know. It's a very tough question. So I just feel probably right now the safest thing to do is for them to stay put, especially, I just assume most of the people who actually travel back, they would have a place to stay, because I know a lot of hostels or hotels actually have been closed overseas as well. So accommodation is a huge issue. But if they do have a place, to stay, maybe staying with their relatives where they are in India, I think staying put and just patiently wait for the border to be reopened at this point, I think that's the smartest thing to do, because right now it's just too much chaos.
And really, you are at the mercy of local governments.
I don't think people would like to hear my answer, but I just feel with so much chaos happening now, that would offer them some stability.
Yeah, it's not the most comforting answer, but again, you're at the mercy of other governments and of airlines too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I just want to get this final point. There are many Canadians who became Canadians after they were displaced, after they fled their home countries and became refugees, and they found a better, a safer life here. There are many Canadians who have also never had that experience. What do you think this situation shows us about, I guess, the safety of home and whether or not that's guaranteed to us?
Definitely, I think there's a lesson to learn here when it's more about our awareness when we travel to always have a plan B. I think people are more aware of the importance to get their travel insurance, for one thing. And when you arrive, you get in touch with Canadian officials, so you're on their radar screen. I don't see Canadians or, globally, people would stop traveling. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think what people needs to be aware of, about, always having that backup plan, know where they are, where to get help. Those little information would really come handy.
Nicholas, thank you so much for your expertise, and I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's Nicholas Keung, the Toronto Star's immigration reporter on the tough mission that is bringing Canadians back home. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mutar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.